By the time the United Nations had drafted, amended, and passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, Heller had earned a BA from NYU, a MA from Columbia, studied Milton, Chaucer, and Shakespeare at Oxford, and was a published short story writer. He would not begin Catch-22 for another 5 years, or publish it for a further 8. If the document serves as the new yardstick for what a rational, universally minded society should uphold and proliferate globally, then the regime created in Catch-22 is its antithesis. The agency of mankind is placed centrally and, perhaps idealistically, puts the onus upon governmental regimes to enforce it. In Catch-22, Heller shows the cynical stridence of the regime's true aim, the dehumanization and instrumentalization of its service members. Without equivocation, by announcing all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, mankind hoped to see itself moving in a more altruistic direction. In attempting to codify human rights, the UN sought to set a new standard for the behavior of mankind, one in which the military regime of Heller's novel is anachronistically aware of and often openly distorts. The presentation of justice and law-keeping are paramount to the regime, yet the actual presiding of justice over those accused is inconsistent, inept, and cruel. The trial of Clevenger, for example, sees a man accused of no crime, yet is predetermined as guilty by virtue of being accused. This marks the military regime on the outset as one not at all interested in basic rights, but rather in punishment, manipulation, and coercion, consistent with Cold War thinking. It is important to view the novel as one looking back onto World War II with the foreknowledge of an active U.S. involvement in Korea. Heller has placed a reading of the article onto the fictionalized version of the U.S. military in an attempt to show what its true nature is and what it could become during the Vietnam War. As Tracy Dockery notes in Just One Catch, Heller's biography, it was this next war that Catch-22 was about, which is why it came to be read in the 60s as a Vietnam book. What becomes clear then is that Heller was writing about contemporary America as much as World War II. As scholar David Seed in the fiction of Joseph Heller notes on Heller's use of temporal manipulation, both Pynchon and Heller insert anachronisms into their texts to break open their fictitious time. Heller inserts references to IBM machines, helicopters, and the political developments of America in the 1950s. Beyond the anachronistic technology, readers have access to the UN's Article 1 as a humanistic framework for the novel. The codification of human rights existing outside of the bureaucracy greatly informs Yossarian's manic flight to Rome, as the narrator intones. The country was in peril. He was jeopardizing his traditional rights of freedom and independence by daring to exercise them. Yossarian is far from a functioning service person and indeed an active liability to the war operation, but maintains the wherewithal to lean onto the rights the regime seeks to deny. In this sequence, the beginning of the chapter, The Eternal City, Milo is seen piously chastising an absent Yossarian for marching backwards and naked. Milo is worried about the danger of Yossarian's naked backwards marching spreading to the rest of the squadron, thereby affecting his syndicate. Beyond the manifest freedom, equality, and dignity offered, the document has clear overtones of mankind as an agent within the lives of others. The document puts forward the notion that all mankind operates as active participants in both life and history, reinforcing the status of humanity as a free, moving entity endowed with the power of choice. The basic rights and ability to make choices will be slowly stripped away from the characters operating within the military regime. Human natality and mortality are of supreme importance in the document, setting out a global persuasion on the delicacy of life. In this arena, the document becomes instrumental in understanding Heller's subversionary tactics of depicting a regime as prioritizing death over life. Article 1 offers it clearly that there are consequences to the taking of another life beyond punitive punishment, yet the military regime promotes it. The rash of deaths, from Clevenger vanishing into the clouds or Doc Tanika's bureaucratized death to Hungry Joe's dream state suffocation and McWatt's brutal killing of Kid Sampson and subsequent suicide, all point to a cascading backslide from an era where life is precious into one which trivializes it. Perhaps no other death than Michaela's, a Roman prostitute, is more trivialized, as MPs seem unfazed by her lifeless body, yet opt to arrest Yossarian for going AWOL. All characters outside the regime's ranking brass are left feeling as if there is nothing left to do but die. Heller's presentation of the only viable option. The character that lets readers back into the comfort of a consequential life is, of course, Yossarian. The bombardier navigates a world in which everyone wants to kill him precisely because he recognizes mankind is still endowed with the power to choose life over death. Yossarian and Clevenger spat over who is trying to kill him. They're not trying to kill you, says Clevenger. They're trying to kill everyone. Is comic, yet utterly devastating to the state in which man finds himself. Perhaps lost within the spectacle, however, is Yossarian's ability to drive mankind towards an existential optimism. In the recognition of his life being at risk and a rejection of an immaterial state of man, Yossarian maintains his will of survival. The process of dehumanization relies upon Jean-Paul Sartre's conception of the human, as derived through his lecture series given in 1946, Existentialism is a Humanism. Sartre offers a definition of the human with, it is in projecting and losing himself beyond himself that he makes man to exist. And on the other hand, it is by pursuing transcendent aims that he himself is able to exist. The generation of the rule Catch-22 is an enshrined example of a regime-created axiom, an activity expressly rejected in Sartre's existentialism, that fosters an environment in which the will for survival is stripped. The military regime concocts nonsense rules for the maintenance of its dehumanizing internal logic. The very act of questioning the code becomes suspect and morphs on purpose. Readers see this as an intuitive response by Yossarian in the previously discussed Eternal City sequence on page 5. Captain Black uses this manipulative tactic to great effect on Milo, even using Milo's own strategy of promoting his syndicate as an entity owned by everyone. Captain Black scolds Milo on the idea of national defense being everyone's job, a mirror of Milo's everyone will have a share. Captain Black justifies the starvation of those who refuse to sign his loyalty oaths by pointing to Catch-22's circular logic, thus placing the moral hazard squarely on Milo's shoulders. He asks rhetorically, it's just like Catch-22, don't you get it? You're not against Catch-22, are you? Readers are left waiting around in the bad faith bylaws of the regime, unable to grasp the true meaning of the code. Yossarian's first encounter with the Catch comes before he turns to pursue survival in earnest. The regime's clear manipulation is on display when the narrator says, Yossarian saw it clearly in all its spinning reasonableness. There was an elliptical precision about its perfect pairs of parts that was graceful and shocking, like good modern art. The shocking nature of the Catch is merely a hint towards the regime's true aim. It is a scarcely real side effect to Yossarian at this point. More pressing to him is its reasonableness as something with great value, but of an indiscernible form. To Doctonica, the Catch is strictly medical, a psychological evaluation determining the sanity of a soldier. To ex-PFC Wintergreen, it is a judicial bylaw governing the punishment of his repeated escapes. In Rome, it represents military police jurisdiction. As the old woman says, Catch-22 says they have the right to do anything we can't stop them from doing. The fuzziness of the Catch and its often violent nature is a decision made purposely for removing the will of survival from the squadron by the military regime, no matter the specifics. In the regime, an ideology of violence and dehumanization takes precedence over logical consistency. One character who paddles fully into the murky sea of existential freedom of choice is Orr. It is clear early on that essential existential optimism of Orr serves as his marker of insanity. Readers first learn of Catch-22 through Yossarian asking Doctonica to ground Orr on account of his insanity. Orr's introduction points readers as well as Yossarian to view him as a consummate outsider, bereft of both interpersonal skills and basic rationality, one seemingly unafraid of death or the military regime. Orr says he stuffed crab apples in his cheek not because he didn't want apple cheeks, but because he wanted big cheeks, and to protect my reputation in case anyone ever caught me walking around with crab apples in my cheeks. The guy's a nut. As the narrative progresses, however, Orr seems to be one of only two characters who have the ability to filter in and out of Pianosa freely, Milo being the second. Orr's freedom of movement and indestructible nature are consequences of his adherence to the supremacy of life over death. He is a tinkering, rowing, crashing personification of existential optimism. Where others attempt to rationalize the danger, Orr sees it for what it really is, senseless violence perpetrated against him. He is one outside the larger dehumanizing system in this sense. In acting within the system by using the regime's ideological code, Yossarian is continually stripping away his own subjectivity and freedom. He is forced to give into the larger group dynamic, fostered by the regime's ideology. Each instance of Yossarian's asking to be grounded, each time he moves the bomb line further across Italy, and each time he hides in the infirmary, Yossarian is going through the channels of the military regime and not placing his long-term survival first, as Orr does. In effect, Yossarian is ditching inner subjectivity, or an interchange of thoughts and feelings, with Orr in favor of the regime's faulty code. It is clear through Colonel Cathcart's continual raising of the mission number, the military regime views the service members as material without personal agency or subjectivity. Yossarian and his cohorts' essence, then, simply is matter. They are bodies to be moved and shipped, placed in precarious positions, not to serve the higher war effort, but to serve an ideological need for militarism, profit, political ascension, and dehumanization. In many ways, Orr is freed from this ideology through basic optimism, where nearly the whole of the squadron clamor for their lives to be saved and end up perishing. Orr avoids this framing, opting to tinker on his stove, fishing pole, and raft, and survives. In this sense, Orr's existential optimism is a shield protecting him. The untiring spirit Orr exhibits, disassembling then reassembling a valve, described as never quickening his movements or slowing them down, never tiring, never pausing in his relentless, methodical, monotonous procedure unless it was to leer at Yossarian with maniacal mischief, may be odd, but is fueled entirely by a rational optimism of survival from the regime. Graciously, Orr attempts to extend this protection to Yossarian, which is refused. Chronologically, the last time Orr is seen before he turns up in Sweden, we get an oddly serious Orr. "Why don't you ever fly with me?" Orr asks suddenly, and looks straight into Yossarian's face for the first time. "There, that's the question I want you to answer. Why don't you ever fly with me?" Still in the midst of his personal dehumanization, Yossarian cannot grasp the necessity of others as a utility in the freedom of choice. Even if Yossarian could understand Orr's invitation, as Heller says,
"Now that would have been a mistake because Yossarian would have capsized that raft and,
Moments later, Yossarian learns of the drowning of Orr's plane and his slow drift across the Mediterranean. As Sartre notes, we will freedom for freedom's sake and through particular circumstances. And thus willing freedom, we discover that it depends entirely upon the freedom of others, and that the freedom of others depends upon our own. Therefore, Orr can be seen as a sort of existential beacon for Yossarian. His willingness to attach himself to others, to be an irritating homo faber to Yossarian, is a byproduct of his existential optimism. Yossarian's stubborn refusal to ask Dreidel, Cathcart, or Korn to fly with Orr is an indication of the trenchant ideology at work. Yossarian is manipulated to a point in which he cannot see a future outside of the regime. Either he will die over Axis Europe or live out his days in a hospital tent. The stark reduction of man to matter as the ideological goal of the regime is pervasive through the novel's bleakest moments. The recurring motif of Snowdon's death over Avignon is a continual reminder for both the readers and Yossarian of man's violent and precarious state of being. Readers are only given glimpses of Snowden's death up until the end, when it is then described in agonizing detail. Heller writes, Yossarian was cold too, and shivering uncontrollably. He felt goose pimples clacking all over him as he gazed down despondently at the grim secret Snowden had spilled all over the messy floor. It was easy to read the message in his entrails. Man was matter. That was Snowden's secret. Drop him out a window and he'll fall. Set fire to him and he'll burn. Bury him and he'll rot like other kinds of garbage. The spirit gone, man is garbage. That was Snowden's secret. Ripeness was all. A reference to Heller's favorite work, King Lear, Act 5, Scene 2. The removal of Snowden's spirit implies an essence existing beforehand, prompting readers to view Snowden's death and funeral as turning points for Yossarian's condition. He then begins to contemplate the terminally materialistic view of man the regime has placed upon the squadron. The visceral experience of Snowden's death yields a new conception of Yossarian's status, that being a clouded mixture of the regime's fatalistic materialism and Orr's existential optimism. Lost in his own metaphysics, Yossarian opts to insert his subjectivity whenever possible by purposely toying with his own materiality. See his naked marching, his moaning during the Avignon briefing, and sitting naked in the tree during Snowden's funeral. Read in concert with Sartre, Yossarian is in the midst of an existential breakdown. Sartre provides a broader view. All kinds of materialism leads one to treat every man, including oneself, as an object. Our aim is precisely to establish the human kingdom as a pattern of values in distinction from the material world. But the subjectivity which we thus postulate as the standard of truth is no narrowly individual subjectivism, for as we have demonstrated, it is not only one's own self that one discovers in the cogito, but those of others too. Being pulled on either side by Milo's capitalist schemes and Snowden's material status, Yossarian demonstrates a great movement into intersubjectivity as he singles out each member of the funeral. In the act of musing upon Major Danby, the chaplain, and the gravediggers, Yossarian mixes their material state with their subjectivity, recognizing their cogito. Existential optimism wins out, but only just. Yossarian's dour pessimism is often mismatched by his actions, as the trauma experienced has led him to view others as more than material, even if he might say the opposite. Indeed, while sitting naked in a chestnut tree watching Snowden's funeral, Yossarian adopts the circular speech pattern of the regime. Milo asks, what happened to him? Yossarian gives only, he got killed. The response offers a vacant implication of an apparent reasonableness to have a funeral for someone who is alive. The incongruities expressed in the sequence are of a person who has admitted it's all over, and yet demonstrably presents his subjective condition for anyone to attach to. Without Yossarian's awareness, the chaplain actually does become attached to him. The chaplain has an unplaceable experience described as, the chaplain elevated his gaze towards Yossarian beatifically, pressed his fingers down over his eyeballs in a manner of affliction, peered upward again towards Yossarian searchingly, and bowed his head, concluding what Yossarian took to be a climactic part of the funeral rite. This revives the chaplain's faith in God. Where Yossarian is left then is a person surrounded by dehumanized individuals, being pulled at by an instrumentalized figure, and with hardly anyone left to share an intersubjectivity. Though it was love at first sight, Yossarian scarcely considers the chaplain to be a part of the squadron. The regime has broken Yossarian to a point in which all logical routes to survival have been exhausted. His only choice left is to row to Sweden. As Heller says,
and he is going, following legitimate channels to try to get off combat duty.
Major, Wintergreen, the flight surgeon, and Milo have all differing reasons as to why they will not help, and each is as illogical as the last. Heller ends this line of reasoning with the ultimate anti-logic.
Goes to Milo. Milo won't help him because he believes everybody should do his duty. And if it's Yossarian's duty to get killed over Bologna, then he should do it, die like a man.
In risking his life for a slim chance at survival, Yossarian is indeed choosing man, but this choice is a mere presentation of the only viable option left. Heller puts it more starkly.
So I should say that in the book, things are manipulated. I mean, I've arranged the ending of the book so that these are the only possibilities available to him. Even collective action is no longer possible to him.
The military regime has removed all other choices as a sort of game of chicken, and Yossarian does not blink. Yossarian is not rowing to a place or objective, but rather from the regime. Any alternative is better than remaining. Even perhaps unaware of this change, Yossarian converts to Orr's existential optimism. Heller.
Exhilaration stems from his answer to the line, Major Danby tells me you'll never get there, and he says, oh hell, I know that, but at least I'll be trying.
Heller inserts references to Shylock from The Merchant of Venice as a metaphor for the chaplain's aloof relationship to the squadron. The spontaneous occurrence of recognizing intersubjectivity is not Yossarian's only effort to resist dehumanization, though. In an ironic twist, Yossarian and the military regime both opt to muddle individual identity as a means of resisting and attempting dehumanization, respectively. Where Yossarian views creating and inhabiting alternative bodies and identities as a potential out of flying, the regime flaunts it as a concerted effort to dehumanize. The instrumentalized soldier must be dehumanized first, the regime knows. American sociologist and an instructor during Heller's time at Columbia, C. Wright Mills, formulates this connection persuasively in his 1956 book, The Power Elite. Mills lays out an American society determined by the interlocking of economic, military, and political structures. Key to the creation and retention of power in the military, Mills argues, is the attempt to break up early civilian values and sensibilities in order the more easily to implant a character structure as totally new as possible. The military regime exists as something beyond a peacekeeping tool or national defense then, and is actually an active force in manipulating the individual. Having a more analytical definition of dehumanization than what can be gathered from Sartre, the field of social ontology asserts dehumanization constitutes the denial that a certain group is equally human, no matter how humanity is defined. Consequentially, the need to foster a common idea of humanity, one in which Article 1 would be anachronistically imposed, is circumspect to the regime. As a result, the regime wastes no time in applying this ideology. Chronologically, the reader's first encounter with the regime is at the Santa Ana, California Army Air Force Base, where Lieutenant Scheiskov's parades are of paramount importance. The parades yield the desired results of denying the humanity of the group by mashing all the soldiers into one, as Seed notes, stripping their ability to respond to clear affronts. He writes, to a certain extent, Scheiskov's sentiments and tactics are endorsed by the narrator, who repeatedly injects fictitious lines to undermine the decorum of what is being described. When Lieutenant Scheiskov triumphs in the military parade by training his men not to move their arms, we are told that he won the parade hands down. The appalling joke becomes slightly more sinister when viewed as a loss of the squadron's voice to raise objections. Much like the formulation of the Catch-22 axiom, this throwaway joke sets the standard of habit for a regime willing to subsume the individual by denying their humanity. The regime is no longer a benign collection of individuals, but an entity with its own dehumanizing ideology, an extension of the othered effect and altered identity. The antecedents for this action comes prior to both the Cold War and World War II, as philosopher John Dewey notes in his 1927 book, The Public and Its Problems. The organic structure of man entails the formation of habit, for, whether we wish it or not, whether we are aware of it or not, every act affects a modification of attitude, and set, which directs future behavior. The breaking down of the soldier as an individual, injecting him into a greater illogical whole, is done in part through installing habits that reinforce and build upon each other, with the common aim of the further dehumanization of others. One example of the reduction to infancy through identity meddling comes through ex-PFC Wintergreen's continual demotions. The habit of escape becomes ingrained in him as to be his state of being, his personal ontology. Besides being busted down to buck private, Wintergreen is sentenced to dig 6x6 holes each day, which he comes to enjoy, saying, "It's not a bad life, and I guess somebody has to do it." Wintergreen is thus merely an instrument of the regime, one in which the removal of categorical titles becomes his sole existence. He is incrementally less and less a person with agency and transcendent aims, but more and more a negated ex-officer. Mills offers a similar desire by the military regime with, "It is this attempt to break up the earlier acquired sensibilities that lies back of the breaking of the recruit and the assignment to him of very low status in the military world. He must be made to lose much of his old identity in order that he can then become aware of his very self in terms of his military role." The manipulated military role Wintergreen would then take is as a master manipulator himself. Wintergreen's status as an instrument has a rippling effect on himself, the squadron, and the regime. The continual demotions land him in a spot as a mail clerk, thus wielding a tremendous amount of power within the regime. Wintergreen's instrumentalization becomes the norm of the regime, which he can then set and reset through manipulating letters, documents, and flight manifests. On the creation of habits derived from the individual affecting the group, philosopher Roberto Frege writes, "Values and norms are ineffectual and therefore unreal till they become embodied in individual habits, patterns of social interaction, and forms of organization." Wintergreen's muddled identity, dehumanized ontology, and unclear aims allows him to dehumanize further through the regime, notably resulting in his involvement in the bureaucratized death of Doc Danica through McWatt's flight manifest. The replacement of survival as his transcendent aim by his determination to embarrass General Peckham allows the function of the regime to effectively flow from him. Wintergreen's headquarters is often the gathering point for voices of dissent and consternation, yet those who arrive are continually rebuffed by Wintergreen's wonky dictums. Wintergreen sends the higher brass into a frenzy, ultimately resulting in the raising of the number of missions to 40 by signing communications as T.S. Eliot and criticizing Colonel Cargill's reports as too prolix. There seems to be no logic to Wintergreen's actions, and as someone in power, he fosters the norm of the regime to be illogical as well. As with Catch-22, Wintergreen is perpetually building and shaping the regime to his liking, one with a specific ideological bent whose aim is to convince its members that they have no subjectivity or freedom of choice. This ideological struggle is placed onto Yossarian in some of the most memorable sequences and lasting images of the novel. In attempting to replace his own identity, obscuring his subjectivity, Yossarian is convinced that he can simply disappear within the regime. As with all his methods to defect that rely on the logic of the system, Yossarian faking a double vision ailment is no real remedy for flying, and even lands him in a morally dubious position. No longer answering to a smattering of doctors, Yossarian is confronted by his fake family, who likewise muddle his identity. "Giuseppe," the mother said. "Ma, his name is Yossarian," the brother interrupted her impatiently. "Can't you remember?" "It's all right," Yossarian interrupted him. "She can call me Giuseppe if she wants to." And the father drew himself up formally to say goodbye. "Giuseppe," he began. "Yossarian," corrected the son. "Yossarian," said the father. "Giuseppe," corrected Yossarian. "Soon you're going to die." This sequence, not the only time Yossarian would assume an alternative identity, is indicative of a soldier whose choices are rapidly diminishing. Yossarian is never fully convinced of his changed identity, yet is willing to exist temporarily in the dream state created by the regime. Added up, it is a terribly lonely sequence. It is one of the only times Yossarian blatantly lies. He even weeps. The sequence can act as a frame of the events to come, as the recurring motif of coldness is hinted at to great effect. As Yossarian is surrounded by his fake family, they give him advice for heaven. The chapter concludes with, "Dress warm," said the mother, who seemed to know, an allusion to Snowden's final words, "I'm cold." Further reference to King Lear. In the military regime of the novel, with its clear parallels to the U.S.'s burgeoning military economy, readers are made privy to an ideology hardly interested in its own survival. Discourse around regimes and ideology, notably by Mills and Michel Foucault, make note of manipulation and coercion, and their corrosive effects on the truth. Yet both rightly insist on the regime's inherent motivation for survival. On the acceptance of power gained from a regime by the population broadly, Foucault says, "What makes power hold good, what makes it accepted, is simply the fact that it traverses and produces things. It induces pleasure, forms knowledge, produces discourse. Manipulation, instrumentalization, or coercion are simply not enough for the regime," says Foucault. They need acceptance and to grow into what he described as apparatuses of governmentality, or a rationality meant to shape the public. Yet the regime Heller has created in the novel has no intention of governmentality. The creation of a rational or semi-rational network of apparatuses presupposes rationality existing within the regime a priori. The regime seems to be its own worst enemy, though, one devoid of basic survival instincts, and certainly not one to produce pleasure, forms of knowledge, or discourse. Into the vacuum of governmentality and rationality comes Milo and his syndicate. No character is an embodiment of an instrument of the illogical ideology more than Milo, minder binder. The narrative introduces Milo off-page, with heavy implication Yossarian views him as the only sane person in the squadron. After a row with Clevenger, the narrator sums up Yossarian's mental state as, "Everywhere he looked was a nut, and it was all a sensible young gentleman like himself could do to maintain his perspective amid so much badness." Notably absent is Milo. For his introduction into the narrative, Milo was away, too, in Smyrna for the fig harvest. Milo's absence is not an indication of rationality at all, but is rather a marker of his function as an instrument of the military regime, one with a free range of movement within the regime. Milo and his syndicate come to be a tendrilled apparatus without much thought of who it might hurt, self included. Milo operates with a freedom of choice explicitly tied to his economic capabilities. But as with Orr, readers do not have access to the specifics of Milo's dehumanization. He is an individual already stripped of the freedom of choice when readers meet him. Interestingly enough, Orr seems to be the only character Milo clashes with. Of Orr, Milo confides in Yossarian, "I just don't trust him," truly representative of a greater struggle between basic optimism and entrenched fatalism. Before the interlocking of economic and militaristic spheres occur, Milo exploits the vacuum of commerce on Pianosa almost by accident. The fruit prescribed to Yossarian for his fictitious liver condition becomes Milo's first export. From there he moves to eggs, buying them for 7 cents and selling them for 5 cents for a profit. Itself a catch-22, Milo's schemes become increasingly insidious, yet alarming to no one. In this sense, Milo and his syndicate offers an eerily prescient warning of the military-industrial complex that would come to envelop the U.S. in the coming decade. President Eisenhower perhaps inadvertently echoes Heller's fiction by saying,
"Now this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society.
Heller was adamant the novel was a discussion on this complex taking place during the Korean War. Yet, I did anticipate, in the sense that it came before the Vietnam War, everything the Vietnam War brought with it, which was, it's not a phrase I ever use, the military-industrial complex. The fear of looming privatization of the military or using its labor for private profit was clearly on Heller's mind. In typical Catch-22 fashion, Milo takes privatization a step further by redistributing U.S. Army Air Force planes to the Germans. Where Yossarian sees this action as a grave mistake, Milo views it as merely an economic venture, thereby hiding behind the pervasive illogic of the regime. On this, Seed offers, the fact that Milo can effortlessly assimilate the Germans into a syndicate implies that the capitalistic ideology binds together two countries more closely than their national hostility against the real enemy, Russia. While Seed is right to point out capitalism as an ideology of the regime, it is worth noting the regime itself is so fragmented with competing desires that one aspect of the ideology cannot be its defining aim. Tony Tanner in City of Words, American Fiction 1950 through 1970 likewise takes a wider view. There is an underlying feeling that those people responsible for inventing and imposing the patterns have a loathing for life per se, and that their mission is not the prevention of the Germans, but the annihilation of anything that seeks to resist the inexorable clamps of their system. As an extension of clamps in this ideology, M&M Enterprises is one massive facade portrayed as codified governmentality. Milo is less concerned about seizing surplus value, but rather broadly conflating the influence of economics and militarism. As the illogic of selling a product at a loss yet yielding a profit is comic in nature, it also does much heavy lifting in establishing Milo's ambivalence towards an actual, rational, and functioning regime. Milo's ever-endearing nature proposes a great disconnect between what he's doing and what he's saying. The insistence that everybody has a share becomes a constant in the novel, yet no one ever sees the dividends. The syndicate name itself, M&M Enterprises Fine Fruits and Produce, is a gross misrepresentation of the loci of power as well as an instance of this disconnect. As the narrator states, the M&M in M&M Enterprises stood for Milo and Minderbinder, and the ampersand was inserted, Milo revealed candidly, to nullify any impression that the syndicate was a one-man operation. The illusion of unity, solidarity, and trustworthiness points to someone using the aesthetics of something resembling communism in an effort to manipulate material gain. Where the squadron is drawn into the syndicate under the guise of profit sharing, they end up being nothing more than instruments themselves. Milo and the regime would, of course, never have any intention of actual profit sharing, nor would they openly admonish capitalism or promote communism. He's a liar. The use of contradictory aesthetics makes its way into Milo's physical description too, as it is a giveaway of someone non-committal and two-faced. The narrator writes, Milo's mustache was unfortunate because the separated halves never matched. They were like Milo's eyes, which never looked at the same thing at the same time. Milo is tearing apart at the seams in a sense, often saying one thing, then doing the opposite. His ambivalence to the consequences of his actions is a clear marker of someone with no agency existing beyond the material. This is presented grimly in the final recurrence of Snowden's death sequence, where Milo has replaced the 12 syrettes of morphine in the first aid kit with a note reading, "What's good for M&M Enterprises is good for the country, Milo Minderbinder." In contrast to the merely dehumanized members of the squadron, Milo is very happy to muddle his identity because his is already finalized as an instrument of the regime. The syndicate catchphrase is itself a metaconflation of fiction and real life. The phrase is a misquote from Charles E. Wilson, former president of General Motors and Secretary of Defense. Milo is divorced from the realities of war, separated from his actions but protected by his own ability to instrumentalize. He is keen to give the illusion of some form of rationality, yet never institute anything near it. He is preoccupied more so with exploiting the economic vacuum on Pianosa than with rational governance. Milo's bombing of Pianosa with planes contracted from Germany is treated in a similar manner to the Snowden death sequence. The sequences mark the only time Heller drops the comic absurdity in favor of a deathly serious tone. As one often bleeds into the other, the sequences have a chilling effect on the readers and characters. Of the two sequences, Snowden's death is rightly more intimate, as the bombing of Pianosa spirals months into the chronology and back again. It is only by convincing Congress that war ought to be left to private enterprise is Milo's syndicate allowed to operate again. Milo smooth talks his way out of treason charges with, "I'd like to see the government get out of war altogether and leave the whole field to private industry." Milo is effectively the spokesperson for the military regime, and his splintered form now has successfully invaded economics. Mills outlines this connection explicitly with, "Accordingly, at the top of this structure, the power elite has been shaped by the coincidence of interest between those who control the major means of production and those who control the newly enlarged means of violence." Or, as Milo comically misremembers Calvin Coolidge, "the business of government is business." The convergence of the military and economic industries is finalized by the confirmation of Major Danby and Yossarian's last conversation. Danby relays to Yossarian Milo's consolidation of power in the form of a merger with Wintergreen and Cathcart. This is Yossarian's last exchange with anyone before he learns of ore arriving ashore in Sweden. They're all partners now in M&M Enterprises. Then there is no hope for us, then, is there? No hope. Wouldn't it be nice if they could disappear us the way they disappeared the others and relieve us of these crushing burdens? How sad. Milo's role as an instrument of the military regime then reaches its zenith with the express consent of the federal government. Milo's role as an instrument of the military regime then reaches its zenith with the express consent of the federal government. What was once a dehumanized, scared individual had morphed into a reconstituted titan, willing to instrumentalize and kill.